Hello, my name is Dr. Jacob Gran, and this is the fifth video in the series on Schenkerian analysis. In this video, we will cover harmonic transformation and the different kinds of chromaticism in Schenker's approach to tonal music. There's a lot to cover in this video, and it will be organized from the very general to the specific. We start with Schenker's view of diatonicism, and then cover the ways in which chromatic transformations are affected at the background and middle ground levels. Then we will look at the idea of transference and Schenker's formulation of harmonic progression and cadence, before ending the video with two specific kinds of chromaticism that occur frequently in the common practice era. Many music students are taught to visualize tonal space in terms of the equal tempered octave on the keyboard. The octave is divided equally into 12 steps, and enharmonic equivalence is assumed, so that E flat and D sharp are really just two different ways of representing the same pitch class. When the equal tempered scale is represented as a clock face, it is extremely useful in modeling late 19th century voice leading and relationships in post-tonal music of the 20th century. If it sounds like I'm setting all of this up as a straw man, it's because I am. This is not Schenker's perspective on pitch organization. Schenker's theory is premised on a much older way of viewing scales in Western music, one that works better for the music of Bach than it does Wagner. For Schenker, there are only 7 diatonic scale degrees that are each fundamentally different in terms of melodic stability. I've tried to visualize that with durational values here. Scale degrees 1 and 8 are really the same thing, and they are by far the most stable point of repose for a melody. Scale degree 5 is the next most stable, followed by scale degree 3. Scale degrees 2, 4, and 7 form dissonant relationships with scale degree 1, so they are inherently unstable, but scale degree 6 is sort of in between. The point here is that for Schenker, the scale is divided into 7 steps rather than 12, and it is a decidedly uneven division. The act of adding an accidental to a scale degree is a kind of transformation between levels that can be called a harmonic transformation. Whether this A is spelled as A flat, or A sharp, or A quadruple sharp, it is still a manifestation of scale degree 6, and no chromatic alteration can cause it to lose the essential characteristics of scale degree 6, the submediant. The background is fundamentally diatonic. Schenker even went so far as to invent a new term, which he called diatony. He wanted to distinguish between the diatony of the background and tonality, which exists at the middle ground and foreground, and includes chromaticism. Even in cases when 2 scale degrees are altered to occupy the same pitch class, like D sharp and E flat, they are still conceptually distinct scale degrees. Composers sometimes play with enharmonic respellings, but Schenker's theory would become overloaded with ambiguities if we did not distinguish between scale degrees. This means that, compared to the equal-tempered clock face perspective, Schenker's chromatic universe contains many more than just 12 pitches. Most chromatic alterations of scale degrees happen at some level of the foreground or middle ground, and in general, the closer to the diatony of the background you go, the less chromaticism you will find. This is a portion of a graph by Schenker of Chopin's revolutionary etude, Opus 10, number 12. We can see that the first layer of the deep middle ground is entirely diatonic C minor. By the way, Schenker considered the minor mode to already be a kind of harmonic transformation of the more basic major mode. In this example, scale degree 2 is counterpointed against 2 notes of the bass line, forming a 6th and a 5th against the notes F and G. This is the typical cadence for a second species counterpoint in the lower voice. Schenker shows how Chopin composes out this prototypical cadence formula with added chromaticism in the middle ground level directly below. Now, the harmonic cadence that plays out over these measures features a chromatic predominant chord, flat 2, also known as the Phrygian 2 or the Neapolitan. Notice how the scale degree 2 that Chopin composed in measure 72 is a D flat, but Schenker vertically aligns it with the diatonic D natural of the preceding level. Harmonic transformations like this one are not represented by slurs or stems or other kinds of specialized analytic notation, but are instead observable by comparing adjacent levels in a finished graph. Schenker does draw attention to the correction of the D flat to the diatonic D natural that occurs in measure 75 by drawing a dashed arrow between those different versions of the scale degree. The most common kind of harmonic transformation is mode mixture, which involves borrowing chromatic versions of certain scale degrees, usually from the parallel minor mode. Here is one of Schenker's deep middle ground graphs of a Chopin mazurka. The mazurka is written in an ABA form in the key of A flat major. Schenker uses a dashed slur to connect the C natural in measure 1, that lasts the entire A section, to the C flat in measure 41 that covers the B section, and he uses another dashed slur to show the connection of the C flat to the C natural that occurs after measure 80 in the da capo reprise of the A section. It is important to point out that this motion from C natural to C flat back to C natural does not constitute a neighbor note motion. Those three notes all represent the same scale degree, so from a diatonic perspective, the soprano voice hasn't moved by step at all. What we have instead is a harmonic transformation of scale degree 3 through mode mixture, since this is the version of scale degree 3 that would occur in the parallel minor mode. Another thing worth pointing out about this example is that when you compare Schenker's graph to the actual music of Chopin's B section, you will notice that Chopin notated the music beginning in measure 41 in the key of E major, rather than F flat as Schenker indicates. The enharmonic respelling is justified because the flat submediant, F flat, is a much more intelligible relationship to the global tonic than the sharp dominant E major would be. Schenker wants to show the underlying relationships between the scale degrees in his analytic notation, whereas Chopin uses his standard notation to indicate to the performer which notes to play. The key signature of E major is much more practical for that purpose. In the previous videos, we discussed various kinds of voice-leading chords, such as passing chords, neighboring chords, and even incomplete neighboring chords. Schenker keeps these voice-leading chords, which arise through the counterpoint, separate from harmonic chords that arise through genuine harmonic progression. When we typically speak of harmonic progression, we tend to think in terms of three functional categories that have different syntactical functions: subdominants, or predominants, which lead to the dominant, which then lead to the tonic. Schenker also has three function categories, but these ones derive from the ersatz, or fundamental structure. For Schenker, the basic harmonic cadence is 1, 5, and 1, shown in the Roman numerals beneath the ersatz. As mentioned previously, the scale degrees of the diatonic background never lose their meaning, no matter what kind of chromaticism is introduced at the middle ground and foreground, which means that Schenker's theory doesn't include a notion of modulation or changing keys. Schenker's theory is monotonal, which means that he views the entire composition to be governed by one key and one harmonic progression in that key, the fundamental structure. Instead of modulation, which implies a changing of keys, Schenker allows for what he calls the transference of the fundamental structure. The basic 1-5-1 progression embodied by the ersatz can be replicated and repeated, sort of like how cells self-replicate in a biological organism, or at least that's Schenker's metaphor. Here we see a transference of the fundamental structure with the harmonic progression shown in parentheses. Schenker often indicated these transferences in parentheses to show their subordination to the real fundamental structure. Notice two things about this transference. First, this harmonic progression takes place at the middle ground level compared to the background level of the fundamental structure. In general, transferences can happen at different levels, including the foreground and various stages of middle ground. Second, the fundamental structure has been transferred to a different scale degree. In this case, it articulates scale degree 5, the dominant. Even while we tonicize scale degree 5 at the middle ground level, it is important to point out that that 5 chord still plays its role as a dominant at the background level. Scale degree 2 in the upper voice, for instance, never stops functioning as a background passing tone between scale degrees 3 and 1. The fact that transferences of the fundamental structure can be applied to any scale degree and at any level of foreground and middle ground means that we are able to make very precise descriptions of small-scale and large-scale tonicizations in a given piece of music. The basic cadence progression of the fundamental structure is 1, 5, and 1 in root position. The upper voice motion is less of a determining factor, which is why I've put them in small note heads. There may, of course, be intervening chords, but you can tell which chords participate in the harmonic progression because the cadence progression usually features chords in root position. If you see a long string of chords in inversion, that usually indicates that the bass line is acting melodically, and that there is a contrapuntal rather than harmonic explanation for the chord progression. So to clarify the difference, this short example from a Chopin waltz shows a melodic bass line that has a contrapuntal explanation. The abbreviations UN and LN are used to show the upper neighbor and lower neighbor, respectively, of a double neighbor figure in the bass and alto voices. Notice the voice exchange of these upper and lower neighbors between the bass and alto parts. In this case, the 5 chords in measures 2 and 3 are neighbor note chords rather than harmonic dominants. We could recompose the waltz so that the 5 chords in measures 2 and 3 appear in root position. This would change our interpretation of the passage so that now we can say that the piece does begin with a genuine harmonic cadence, shown with the slurs in the bass to the structural 1, 5, 7, and 1 chords that are also indicated with Roman numerals. Of course, this is not an improvement on Chopin's waltz. He chose to begin with a melodic bass line for a good reason. In general, the placement of cadences and their function in the compositional scheme is one of the most important style considerations across the common practice tonal era. So far, we haven't mentioned the predominant function, which has a special place in Schenker's harmonic cadence. Structural predominants occur directly before the structural dominant of the cadence, which means there is only one per cadence, and they are indicated with a doubly curved slur. The slur in this example that connects the initial C to the structural G could have been curved over the bass note F, rather than curving once underneath and then curving again to approach the G from above, as it does. Notice that this slur overlaps with the slur from F to G, which is something you don't normally see in a well-formed graph. Schenker used this notation deliberately to draw attention to the harmonic importance of the structural predominant chord. We use the doubly curved slur when the predominant bass note is scale degree 2 or scale degree 4. And when the predominant bass note is scale degree 3, we instead use the normal notation for an arpeggiation. We can also have what Schenker calls an incomplete transference of the fundamental structure. That means that only one of the two tonic harmonies of the cadence is present. Here we see a case where the initial tonic is missing. At the foreground level, the notation for this harmonic relationship looks much like that of an incomplete neighbor note, and the two concepts have a lot in common. We can call this relationship a front-relating dominant, since we first get the dominant, which then relates conceptually to the structural tonic that happens after. Very often, this configuration appears as an applied dominant, when the incomplete transference occurs on scale degrees other than the tonic. And this is one way in which composers can introduce chromaticism and to effect temporary tonicizations. This piece by Chopin is an excellent example of this kind of incomplete transference. Where other composers might have notated the melody beginning in measure 5 more conventionally, Chopin uses upward and downward stems to show how the chromatic wedge that serves as an introduction continues through the theme as a compound melody and does not reach resolution until the tonic cadence in measure 12 at the end of this example. Let's represent the theme in analytic notation. Let's not get distracted by the complicated compound melody in the upper voices, but instead turn our attention to the harmonic progressions found in the bass line. The first bass note, F, is connected by an ascending register transfer to the F in measure 10. That F then returns to the original register, which acts as a dominant in the middle ground cadence 5 to 1 in measures 11 and 12. The first register transfer from measure 5 to measure 10 is accomplished by an ascending arpeggiation through the tones of the tonic triad. These are the stemmed tones in measures 6, 8, and 10. Notice how Chopin gives each structural tone of the arpeggiation its own incomplete harmonic cadence. First, a front-relating dominant to articulate scale degree 1, then another that tonicizes scale degree 3, and finally one on scale degree 5. These short tonicizations introduce a lot of chromatic activity and excitement, and the unprepared dominants create a sense of forward momentum. Notice that these three foreground cadences coordinate within the larger bass arpeggiation, and that arpeggiation is embedded within a larger middle ground 5 to 1 cadence. This type of off-tonic beginning to a piece, which stretches out an incomplete transference, is called an auxiliary cadence. Just as we could create an incomplete transference by omitting the initial tonic, we can also create one by omitting the final tonic. This kind of incomplete cadence is called a back-relating dominant, and it is commonly found at half cadences. This theme by Handel is full of back-relating dominants. The chord-to-chord voice leading in this example would be difficult to explain without the concept of a back-relating dominant. Notice, for instance, the non-resolution of the leading tone C sharp in measure 2 to the unexpected F major chord in measure 3. In our analytic notation, these two chords are not directly connected by any kind of slur. The voice leading of the A major triad relates only backwards to the D minor triad that generated it. Similarly, the C major chord in measure 4, which moves surprisingly up the circle of fifths to the G minor chord in measure 5, is explained as a back-relating dominant to the preceding F major triad. Notice also how this entire phrase can be described as a middle ground motion from the initial 1 chord in the first measure to the back-relating dominant in measure 8. Schenker uses the dividing power of the back-relating dominant to explain the half-cadence division that typically occurs between antecedent and consequent phrases, as well as in larger formal divisions that I won't get into here. Now let's finish the video by going over Schenker's explanation of two of the most common chromatic transformations in the 18th and 19th centuries, the augmented sixth chord and the Neapolitan cadence. Here we see a simple descending bass line pattern from scale degree 1 to scale degree 5, which goes by many different names. Some call it the Andalusian cadence, some call it the descending tetrachord, and chromatic versions of this descent are often called a lament bass. The final stepwise motion from scale degree 6 to scale degree 5 covers the interval of a semitone and is often called the Phrygian cadence. Let's show this chord progression in analytic notation. The two chords in the middle are understood as passing chords that support the linear progression from the initial tonic chord to the dominant chord on the next downbeat. Let's add some chromaticism to the upper voice. Here I've transformed the G natural of beat 2 into a G sharp, which functions as a chromatic passing tone on its way to the A of beat 3. I included this not because it has anything to do with augmented sixth chords, but because I don't want you to get the impression that the only applied dominants are those created by incomplete transfers of the fundamental progression, like we saw earlier in the video. You can also get applied dominants and applied leading tone chords that arise contrapuntally as voice leading chords, like the passing chord in this example. If we add another chromatic passing tone, this time an A sharp between A and B, we generate an augmented sixth chord. The interval of an augmented sixth resolves outwards in contrary motion to the octave Bs on the next downbeat. This is the same augmented sixth that would be produced by adding the customary leading tone to counterpoint exercises over a Phrygian cantus firmus, and Fuchs warns us not to do that in strict counterpoint. The Phrygian cadence with leading tone is possible in free composition. In this case, we have formed a French augmented sixth, but the Italian and German sixths are generated in the same way, but with different inner voice motion. A lot of ink has been spilled over what the root of an augmented sixth chord really is, but for Schenker, the question isn't so urgent, since all augmented sixth chords function as voice leading chords and are explained by the outer voice counterpoint rather than by root motion. We encountered the Neapolitan earlier in our discussion of Chopin's revolutionary etude in the section on harmonic transformation. The Neapolitan is a special kind of mode mixture because it actually borrows from a specific mode, the Phrygian mode, which has a naturally flattened scale degree 2. For that reason, Schenkerians more often refer to it as the Phrygian 2 than as a Neapolitan. Here is a famous use of the Phrygian 2 as a chromatic predominant in the opening cadence that frames the key of C sharp minor in the first movement of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. Here we see a completed harmonic cadence, where flat 2 functions as a chromatic predominant. D natural occurs here in an inner voice on beat 2 of the third measure. Notice the dashed arrow above the reduction that shows how the lowered 2 becomes corrected to the natural version of scale degree 2 in the next measure. As a rule with Neapolitans, we always try to point this out somehow. The lowered scale degree 2 does not persist as a lowered fifth over the structural 5 chord at a cadence. So we point out this diatonic correction even if we have to use implied tones. For instance, if the composer omits the fifth from the voicing of the 5 chord. This was hopefully the longest video I will make, but I hope after this video that you will begin to see the big picture about how the various topics we've covered so far fit together. Structure in a composition is typically provided by functional harmonic progressions, of which there is only one basic prototype. The chords of these structural progressions can be horizontalized through processes like arpeggiation to open up space for melodic activity. Then those spaces can be filled in by diminutions, such as passing tones and neighbor notes. The next video will cover displacement and Schenker's theory of meter, rhythm, and form.